we'll start now so we have an extra couple minutes because we got lots of great stuff to talk about. So thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. For giving up, I don't know, for some of you guys giving up your lunchtime, but I'm glad some of you guys brought it in. So thank you for being here today. Right now we're going to talk about like this real growing movement around the value of credentials and how do we know that a credential has value? How do we know that a student that is paying their hard-earned money or taking out loans to do so are actually going to end up with meeting their goals and having career success with a sustainable wage. And so there's a lot of conversations going on about that right now. And so I have this awesome panel that's going to come talk about it from a variety of different perspectives. I'm Sarah DeMark. I'm from the Western Governors University. I'm the Vice Provost of Workforce Intelligence and Credential Integrity. Also serving as the Executive Director in an interim capacity for the Open Skills Network. And so I'll start down the line, and if you want to give your brief introduction, and then we'll start with questions.
Sounds great. I don't project, so let me know if you can't hear me, particularly at the back. Just like put your hand up. Thank you. So my name is Jake. I'll stop tapping my mic. I work for LinkedIn. I run workforce development for LinkedIn, but I also do a lot of our internal skills strategy. So as we are trying to move from being a social network to a skills-first organization, I've been advising our product teams and others, and working really closely with a bunch of higher ed institutions like WGU to the extent that they, I think, can be a source of information for us. I also founded Canada's largest software bootcamp. It's called Lighthouse Labs, and advise a bunch of startups sort of in this space. But it's a pleasure to be here. I also really quickly wanted to point out that as a Canadian, I have to note from a diversity perspective that I would love if somebody on this panel wasn't white. And I think in the future we can do better on that, but apologies.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Amber Garrison Duncan. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Competency-Based Education Network, and we help colleges and universities build flexible, relevant programs based on competency rather than seat time and grades. And WGU is an awesome member, and so we're glad to be here, and thank you again for the acknowledgement of what the panel looks like, and we would support that too.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sean Gallagher, Executive Director of the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy at Northeastern University. And we do research at the intersection of work and learning. So really study what's happening in this space in terms of particularly what employers are doing and thinking about and how they view credentials when they hire, but also innovations in the post-secondary education universe, experiential learning, and themes like that. Good to be here.
Hello, everyone. Jason Tishko. I'm a Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber Foundation. For those of you who may not know, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the world's largest business association. We represent over 1,500 state and local chambers of commerce across the country and collectively over 3 million firms. I'm here representing the foundation side of the house today, which is our nonprofit affiliate that has a social impact mission, and there I oversee our workforce portfolio, where we're trying to close the partnership gap with employers as well as the data gap and the finance gap, and I'll share more about that as the panel progresses.
Good afternoon. I'm Luke Dowden. I'm the Chief Online Learning Officer at the Alamo Colleges District in San Antonio, Texas. I work with 5 Hispanic serving community colleges. They're all independently accredited, and we have the only college that also has historically black college designation. And so I live in a majority city. I love the city that I live in. Unfortunately, we have the highest rate of urban poverty. So the people that I'm serving are not stable, and my main job is reminding the people that I work with every day that we are trying to benefit people that aren't stable. And so I'm really happy to be here. Sarah asked, and I said yes.
Yeah.
So, all right, Sarah.
Well, thank you. I mean, hopefully you guys are excited about, as I am, about the great comments that we're going to get from our panelists. So I think to start, as I mentioned, we're really starting to see some pushback around the value of education, sort of, do I get a degree? Is it worth my investment in getting a degree? So what are some of the things that you guys are seeing that you're optimistic about in terms of how do we start to evaluate whether or not a credential will actually hold value for an individual? So I don't know. Does anybody want to start? I can
Sure.
go down the line.
Yeah, happy to
Okay,
jump
go
in.
ahead.
I mean, I think there's a couple different perspectives that I come to this from. One is I'm a huge LMI geek, a labor market information geek, and I think to the extent that post-secondaries are working with employers directly or sort of at a slightly more macro level, just using that data to inform their curriculum, and WG is probably, top 3 in the world or something for doing that. the schools themselves will function better. The students will get better labor market outcomes because of that input. I also think the conversation is a super healthy one for higher ed to be having right now, because it is helping higher ed respond to challenges that will, in my opinion, within 5 to 10 years be existential for many, many institutions. And while that's certainly not a threat for WGU, the vast majority of the post-secondaries that I work with, for instance, in Canada, are struggling with adaptation, in part because they're all publicly funded, whereas in the US, they aren't adapting even as fast and aren't publicly funded. So you got to figure times are going to get more tough unless they start thinking about student outcomes to a much, much greater extent than they are now.
I think that's a great point. The thing that we see with institutions who come to competency-based education, and we survey our institutions, is that they're coming to competency-based education because they believe it's a way to serve learners they've not traditionally served, and to make sure that there are employable outcomes at the end. And so knowing that there's a growth of institutions, we work with about 600 institutions that are moving this way out of the a little over 4,000 in the US, right? So that's a great movement. The other thing I would just highlight from a systems quality assurance perspective is you can see anybody who's engaged in quality assurance having at least a conversation. So some of our traditional national accreditors who are saying, we have big questions that we can't answer for institutions. Is everything that when we accredit an institution, are we accrediting everything that they offer and do? There's not an answer to that question. Or our professional associations who are starting to think differently about moving from an input-based quality assurance method to an outcomes-based focus. So how do we really, again, start to reevaluate what we call quality, what that looks like, and what the value is to employers and the learner?
Yeah, I guess we'll go down the line. I mean, it's tricky. So a lot of our work focuses on new types of credentials, right? And if you go back a number of years, everyone was excited about the nano degree, the micromasters. These are trademark terms alongside certificates, badges. And I found that a lot of the energy is just the plain old certificate, which can mean 100 different things in terms of a weekend program, for credit, non-credit. And so I know employers are interested in those types of credentials. They're beginning to see them more on resumes or on LinkedIn profiles, et cetera. But it still is kind of the Wild West. And I know that a lot of us overlap in terms of, okay, we need standards. We need technical standards, and we need data and transparency, but we also need conceptual standards in terms of if you're a higher ed institution or an industry provider, like Google offers certificates, just as one example. Growing number of employers are creating new credential offerings. We need to kind of agree on, well, what's in there, right? And so I think it's a wonderful vision that a lot of us share, to have a world where it's driven by data, but then at the same time, I think you need a package that's actually going to signal something to an employer as a hiring decision. And then also, I mean, just in conversations here with Uber drivers or whomever, to the consumer, the learner on the street who, they've never maybe heard of a digital badge, never mind a hiring manager, and know what's in that container, if you will. So I think we're trying to work toward that system versus being able to wave a magic wand right now and say, okay, well, here's the data, here's the technology platform, and if you can see the competencies, it's going to really mean something in the marketplace. So I think it's still quite early, and hopefully we can get to a spot where, basically there's a larger market for all this. And especially at this event, I think about various providers and what's in their interests, and basically can you have a sustainable business around some of these new credentials, and then also, and I'll stop, the quality assurance side. That I think is still emerging too. You mentioned accreditation, a boot camp. How do we signal that an educational provider is a quality provider, right? That's still an emerging world too.
Well, and whether all of the credentials from that provider are they're sort of that same level. So I think you can't even leave it at the provider level. It's everybody's kind of doing different things under that umbrella too, which makes it more complicated. So same question, but maybe like from an employer lens, like how is an employer supposed to sort of make any sense out of these? Well, I think Credential Engine says 1 million different credentials that are out there. It's a little chaotic, so.
Thank you, Sarah. So I want to unpack the credential side and then the value side.
Yeah.
And for the first point, we already have a mass proliferation of credentials, and it's only going to get more diverse and proliferate even further. So it's going to get complex out there, and you're going to have different issuing bodies where I like to say employers are going to be the new educators themselves, and HR is going to be the new registrars. You're going to have employers, they already are, per Sean's remarks, already issuing credentials. And you're going to have a lot of other non-traditional settings where credentialing and transcripts are going to become a hot topic. So it's happening, it's going to be happening in the private sector, so it's going to proliferate, which brings a lot of questions to the value side, because do we even have the data collection systems in place or the type of LMI needed to really assess value for this massively proliferating space? And then when you ask value, you got to say value by whom? Because on the one hand, you can look at just direct outcomes data for learners who have gone through certain programs or earned certain credentials, have what kind of outcomes. But then you could also look at value from the employer perspective, and which employers value which programs and credentials and incorporate them into their talent pipeline. So we've been working on that side of the equation through our talent supply chain system, where we've been having employers better signal which programs, which credentials they're actually recruiting as part of their talent sourcing strategy. But we've also been doing a lot of work on the data side, because if you even look at the outcomes data today, it is very incomplete. And we are making some pretty profound statements about outcomes on very incomplete data. So one of the things we're trying to do through the Chamber is to work with partners on an initiative called JEDX, the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange. And simply put, it's an effort to implement data standards for job descriptions as well as for employment records. So data about the job, data about the person in the job, and to do it in a structured, standardized way. And one of the reasons why we want to do it, and happy to get into the mechanics of it, is if we do it and do it right, we would be able to organize and share more granular, structured, standardized data about employment outcomes that's going to tell us a lot more about what's actually happening in our labor market today. So we could connect that data back to specific credentialed programs or combine them with certifications and credentials and get a better sense or produce better analytics around what combination of credentialing is achieving what outcomes, and then how do we determine value based on that. So there's a long way to go, but some work's underway, because if we want to tell a better story about the value of credentialing, we need to make sure we have a more complete data infrastructure that can tell the whole story, but we need better outcomes data because we're not there yet.
Can I
Right.
jump in with something? I didn't
course.
expect to be the Canadian on the panel, but I'm ending up that way as opposed to the LinkedIner. But one of the things that I've been shocked at is the US data is actually pretty good relative to ours, as an example. So like we have an entirely publicly funded system basically, and yet governments haven't forced the schools that they pay for to provide them back the same student outcomes that in the US, the College Scorecard and others have done an amazing job of producing. Now I appreciate there's some gaps, and so I thought you might be able to tell us a bit more about what those gaps were, because in my mind, longitudinal data is probably part of it, right? Like it's once they leave the school, once they're into the employer, that's when the data ends. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Well, the easiest example right now is if you're using our unemployment insurance system and the wage records, that information is not standardized. You have 50 plus different systems, different ways of measuring earnings. So you can't compare the data across states accurately. And you have these big missing pieces, one of which is occupation. So we're making we have all this guesswork out there about what you're actually doing within a given industry, but we don't actually know what occupation you're in. So there's these things we could clean up, and happy to go into the history of it, but some of this we've been trying to solve since the 80s, and it hasn't happened. But there's some new innovations and more public-private approaches that are seeking to close those gaps, with one of the leading use cases being we need better outcomes data. We need to be able to tell a better story about what combination of learning and credentialing produces what kind of outcomes. So we're trying to close those gaps, and for the first time, at least in the US, we're doing it in a more public-private way, and we're doing it through data standards.
Thank you.
And I would add on a gap
Please.
is we can produce a college scorecard for bachelor's degrees for first-time, full-time enrollments. So we know we've got 37 million adults with some college, no degree. We have millions of adults who are returning and going to school part-time. All of those millions of people are not captured in our data system, as well as certifications are not standardly reported. So if you earn something that's outside of the degree, we actually don't know enough about what that looks like. So those are the gaps I think we've been working on trying to shore up. Is we can't know unless we again start to get this data. And so there's been a lot of movement from the Chamber and National Student Clearinghouse folks to try to figure out how we get better data, especially too when we want to disaggregate that. If we want to disaggregate that by race, ethnicity, or by income, we can't currently do that. So we actually can't see where our inequities are showing up and how we need to address those.
Right, and the lag time that reminds me of. So we'd have the data.
lag time.
but right now it's about 2 years, right? So 2019, so that could be useful data, looking back at 2019. And then you have real-time systems like LinkedIn or MC and Burning Glass, and sort of like, you know, when you get a market that's harvesting a lot of that data information direct from employers, often that can be more useful in certain ways. But of course, it's proprietary, and you all do a lot of great sharing, many of those firms, but the data is lagging.
Well, so Luke, so what are you seeing just from a higher ed system perspective?
So the discussion on outcomes is interesting to me because I may be looking at student survey data around a micro-credential one day and sitting with a very large employer the next day, right? And there's two lenses on outcomes. For the student is, what's the job that I can get with this training, and can I live on it, right? And what will it do for me? So there's a real twist for the student being, for me, a more savvy consumer. And I see that across the board, right? They're not going to commit to taking on debt that they don't have an assured outcome for. I think we're past that time, at least in the lower 48.
Totally.
So from the employer, and I saw this really intensely last week with a very large healthcare provider, it's retention. I mean, we want to, our outcome is, can we train them, and are they still here in 3 months, and are they still here in 6 months, and do we have a clear path to move them up? And they're concerned about things like this employer. I mean, you never know what kind of conversation you're going to get into, right? But critical care is talking about bath techs. We need people that can bathe critical care patients and not knock out their intubation tubes, which is very bad if you know healthcare, right? Or you have and you have to work around equipment and loved ones while you're doing it with care. How do you train for someone for that, right? So is that a job? So I'm in these situations. So is that a job? Does it have a code? How do we link to it? Where does it go from there? So I think there's two very, very different lenses. The other thing that I'm really surprised with this recession, if that's what we're calling it, is then the last one I watched with great sadness as employers retrenched from tuition assistance programs. And I've watched with great amazement that they've not gone away this time. So this past decade has been nice, and we're into another decade because employers are like, no, we're doubling down. And I heard it last week. The chief nursing officer said, wait, how many people did you have in your pilot? And I gave her the number, and she said, we'll guarantee 300 interviews. I was like, for a badge? She's like, yes. And if they pass that, we'll hire them tomorrow.
Amazing.
So it shows you kind of where we are. But I'm seeing two different lenses. They don't always match up, but more times than not they do.
Yeah.
So I just want to respond to Luke, is that employer lens is very consistent with how we're talking about it in the business community. Within our talent supply chain networks, we have a whole different set of ROI metrics that we care about. That's a very different language than how education talks about it. It's a both and approach. But when we approach partnerships around programs or credentials, we're looking at what are the bottom line metrics that matter most to companies who are coming together to source talent from these preferred programs. And the things we talk about, is it going to reduce time to fill position? Is it going to reduce onboarding and training costs? Is it going to improve retention rates? Is it going to help us hit our diversity goals? They set different metrics, and they're not necessarily cut and paste from every company to every company, but getting them to communicate, this is what value means to me in a partnership, is often very different than how we communicate it from the other lens. So we need to make sure we have a framework that can bring both perspectives together, because if the employer can see the value proposition and can activate a transparent ROI, they're hooked. They're going to stay in, and this is now a business relationship.
Right.
This isn't just about recruiting on a campus anymore. So that's what we've been exploring. We're trying to promote more of those best practices in the private sector. But I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. Value means different things at different audiences.
The other thing the two chambers told us, you'll appreciate this, they're like, Luke, you can call it whatever you want. But if you use the term micro-credential or digital badge or digital credential or alternate credential, you're responsible for educating us. So if you introduce the term, you're responsible to educate us. I was like, oh, okay, no problem. But it's feedback we didn't expect, but they're totally right.
So Luke,
Sorry.
your answers have been dead on, and so I'm going to ask you a hard question, and I apologize, Sarah. I know I'm not the moderator, but it's
All good.
In Canada, more people go from a community college to a university than vice versa. And it changed recently because community colleges are getting folks the jobs and the universities aren't. So now it's the reverse. More people graduate from a university and go to a community college. And the result is that community colleges are getting more funding and are like they're delivering on, in essence, the sort of objective of a CC. In America, that's not the case, right? And I expect in your case, it might be, like in your case, your institution is delivering ROI. Why is it not happening for the vast majority of community colleges in America?
Well, the maturity level of community colleges across the United States are different. I left a state that I actually saw the creation of the community college system as a recent college graduate and moved into a state that's so they use a language around performance excellence. So I moved to San Antonio wondering if I needed to become bilingual. And they're like, no, but the language they didn't tell me I need to learn was that of performance excellence. Mm-hmm. And I know you've all heard of imposter syndrome. I was sitting in my first meeting and people started talking about OFIs. I was like, what is an OFI? What are they talking about? And quickly we learn, right? But we're, so there's
What's
there's
an OFI?
yeah.
I know I'm like,
sorry.
I know an OFI is.
It's an opportunity for improvement. So we're a Baldrige Award-winning district, right? And so we're very anchored in getting better and knowing your data deeper.
And
So
what's the Baldrige
we
Award?
know our data so well that we know our top 5 institutions where our students transfer,
Yeah.
and we know that they do better than the students that start at the university. So our students transfer into University of Texas San Antonio and outperform their native students. But that's, but it's not like that everywhere, Jake, and that's just because of the different maturity levels of community college. And then it's also about performance. I mean, we're in a very unique district. We are extremely focused on performance. You have to know your data deep down, not just surface level data.
Without naming names, can you speak to the other state? And then I apologize for that.
Yeah, so I was in Louisiana,
Okay.
and we had a governor that said, we need community college. We had technical colleges. My dad is a product of one. He was a bookkeeper, made a decent living at that, right? But we had no community college system. And if you go there now, like they've really kind of had to fight their way to become relevant in the ecosystem, but not in Texas. I mean, Texas community colleges are very powerful and competitive.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I'm sorry. I didn't
No,
mean to-
that's
I think
great.
they're
he got
also-
me excited about the
I know, I can tell. I can tell.
And it's funded very differently. I think that's the important thing too. If you look at community college quality assurance processes, you're accountable to an employer, you're accountable to a creditor at a national level, you're accountable to probably specialized accreditation, also a district by which you belong that's connected to a K-12 system. So the complexity of that is, right, like just from a data ask, right?
And
There's one more?
There's one more. We have command performances twice a month in front of an elected board of trustees. Twice a month. These are after hours, 6 to 10 o'clock sometimes. So
Wow.
there's a high level of accountability in community colleges in Texas.
But
Serious.
the money to follow that up. So
That's right.
community colleges in this country have been woefully underfunded and looked down upon because of the type of learning they provide and the learners that they've served. And so there's huge inequities in what type of funding from all those different sources actually make it to the college.
Right.
Yeah.
And our university system is much more active in offering certificates, part-time programs, online programs than Canada. And I think maybe the most interesting example is like if you want to become a software developer or a mobile app developer, right now you have so many different options. You can go to a community college, you could go to a university, you could do a full-time program, part-time program, an online program, a coding boot camp, you could go to Coursera. I mean, there's kind of endless options, and all of those will very likely potentially get you that job. And so there's certain zones, there's certain occupations where there's this kind of proliferation of options. I know that computer science field is sort of special in that regard. Then you get into licensure. Maybe you can talk a bit about regulation, Jason. But basically, if you're in a licensed profession or occupation, then you have to get academic credits or complete a certain certification program, licensure program.
Hours.
And some of that's very necessary, and some of that also inhibits innovation in terms of the kind of cartel that manages access to economic opportunity.
Yeah, licensure, there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs. But there are certain things it does that are done well, but what we've often found is the transferability issues around it are just mind-numbing, and they don't move. So like you mentioned, I wouldn't use the word cartel necessarily, but you get locked into that license.
I was waiting for that comment.
You get locked into that license, and
You can't move across states, maybe.
It
No.
restricts your mobility significantly.
And it's based on hours.
It's based on hours, and it's more often than not, it's guarded by the profession itself. And there's a different set of incentives at play there. But what's missing from a quality assurance perspective, the missing signal that I would argue in our marketplace of credentialing is the demand signal from employers. So we've often talked about the triad as you got the federal government, you got the state government, you got the accreditors. But I think we need to reinvent the triad, and we need to say yes, there's government, there's accreditors, but we need employers sending that signal. Which credentials do employers value? And we have quality assurance systems in our space. We've been running global talent supply chains for nearly a century. And it works. And companies understand I need to meet a stackable standard if I'm going to be eligible to do business as part of somebody's talent supply chain. It's the ISO system. And I'm not saying we need to adopt that, but if you took a business model like that, it's fundamentally different than how accreditation works in this country. And it would allow the business community to establish a set of standards to say, if you want to be recognized by the business community or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, call it whichever you want, we will establish that standard. Alamo colleges could go and be benchmarked against that standard by an objective third-party auditor, and if you're found to meet it, you get our seal of approval. That doesn't mean we're going to necessarily give you something, but you can go to your students and say, my programs meet the standard, and you can go to companies and say, if you're looking to recruit from somebody, I meet this standard, you should be taking a look at my campus if you don't know me, because I'm on the list. And that's a different signal than we have today, because we have all these other mixed signals, but if you want to know which programs and credentials meet the business community standard, there is no such signal.
Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking about some of the certifications that are out there, and they do have ANSI certification for the 17024, and a lot of the push to do that is, at least from the IT side, is for the Department of Defense funding for that. So it would be interesting, I think, if there was more of a signal that, is something like an ANSI standard or ISO standard that could be applied to some of these credentials to be able to sort of differentiate between which ones have followed best practices and are actually meeting a market need.
And those signals are just as important to learners. So I'm on
That's
the
right.
learner side. Like they can't see that either,
Yep.
right? They can't see the clear path. And that's why I like the work of the Community College Growth Engine with Ed Design Lab, because they're really focused on the learner journey, the on-ramps, the off-ramps, and how this isn't this crazy credit or not credit. No, this all needs to blend more.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Amber, do you think we'll finally, at a moment in this country, we're going to figure out credit for prior learning? It's been around in all these different forms, but it's a nice feature that competency-based has figured out how to incorporate. Sorry, I asked her a question, but I just am like really interested. Are we finally there? I've been in higher ed for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
I'm like, is this the moment? Are we finally going to make non-credit, non-standard learning experiences relevant in this whole credit system that we're in?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I do think it relates to quality assurance because a lot of our quality assurance demands institutions work in a credit hour model, which has thwarted credit for prior learning issues. Because if I'm going to come in and show you that I already know and can do something, or maybe I had a certification someone else has already verified, they look at that and say, well, we have to reassess that and we'll decide if it's of quality. No, that's already of quality. This learner has already mastered that. Let's meet them where they're at and move them forward. And so it is a great complement with competency-based education. All of our institutions use that as a major way, one, to bring students back, because who wants to go in and say, oh, I've already learned all this, but let me sit through the content again. No one wants to do that. And then being able to say, again, how do we add value? How do we make sure that value leads to employability? That's really, really critical and important. I do think there's some pushes on us to do more credit for prior learning data systems that are going to allow, we talk about it's like shovel and pick work because you've got to dig in and see what's in there. What is somebody bringing with them? It's not very transparent. So some of the moves around the learning and employment record that are competency based allows us to see that, allows us to see demonstrations of what the person actually did. And then to do degree audits or credential audits, automating those because we understand here's what competencies are required to meet program level outcomes. And I can now, again, give you max credit. I'm not doing, what we do now is compare, does this course match up with this course? And if everything matches, you get 3 credits. If it doesn't, you get 0. It's all or nothing. So working in a competency-based way, again, allows us to maximize what somebody brings with them. And again, make sure we add value right away. So I do feel the movement happening. Again, more and more institutions are working to do this. And even if they've not gone full competency-based, I think enough people are walking away that they're having to get on board. And the number of traditional age students coming through the pipeline is declining and will decline for the year on out. So again, that 36 million, some college no degree folks, if you are trying to find a market to get into, there's lots of people to serve.
I wanted to jump in and maybe tie some of these things together because I could not agree more with the emphasis on prior learning, and I think that it's something that relates to your other question about how employers need to learn how to communicate what they need in terms of skills as well. And I use the term skills pretty specifically there because I think this conversation as of yet has been at the credentials level, but a lot of our organizations are doing a lot of work at the skills level as well. And it's the thing that I'm most proud of LinkedIn doing right now, which is we're trying to sort of use that, I'm going to say behavioral economics approach. I don't think that's what our company is describing it as, but we're certainly trying to nudge employers and learners to start representing the skills that they have or need in the form of skills as opposed to in the form of degrees or
Yes.
like years
Absolutely.
of experience at X company, et cetera. And my favorite example of why that's so necessary from a prior learning perspective is if you're a refugee and you spend 5 years crossing borders, you're learning a ton of skills.
Yeah.
And whether it's the project management of like a family of 6 that you have to get across a bunch of circumstances, or the language skills, or the communication skills, or navigating bureaucracy, et cetera. But we don't make it easy either for the individual to represent those skills or for an employer to say, hey, somebody else, like maybe an educational institution, went through that assessment process and recognizes that this individual does have project management, comms, et cetera. And so I think you can see schools moving more into the role of assessors, and you can see organizations like LinkedIn encouraging employers, encouraging learners to start thinking about themselves as having skills, not just credentials or experience.
Well, in helping individuals understand the skills that they have, I mean, I think even if, in your example, right, like if you talk to a refugee that's been crossing borders for 5 years, they wouldn't say they have project management skills.
Correct.
I mean, they absolutely do, but they don't think about it that way. So I think having more of that skills-based transparency into these credentials is not just great for employers understanding what they're looking for and how to hire individuals that have those skills, but also just empowering individuals to understand the value of the skills that they're achieving as well, I think is a critical piece.
And we probably in the room really undervalue that. And it was really in my face this summer. We embedded a resilience badge in a course. We had a student send the faculty member an email, and she said, I was in an interview for a job with the city, and I realized that I was interviewing for the wrong job. And actually, there were 2 other jobs that I should have interviewed for. So I did. I got an offer on Friday, and I'm starting on Monday. And the resilience badge helped me to see myself differently. The amount of agency that
Yes.
valuing a skill, what
Yeah.
you said, can have is we way undervalue that, right? It's just not even in our line of sight,
It's empowering.
right?
It is.
So it's nice to see someone really benefit from something as
Yeah.
elemental as a resilient skill. Anyway, I wanted to give you that example because you
I
opened
like
the door about skills.
Totally.
Yes, sir. A point I wanted to bring up too is if we think there should be more credentialing and more alternative routes to credentialing, and it should be more focused on the value it creates for regardless of which lens you're looking at, we got to look at the business model and the incentives, because right now we have an incentive structure that does not reward that. It constrains it, and it's constrained with an eye towards, well, we need to protect students in a quality way, but really what it's doing is dramatically stifling innovation. So if I'm trying to
That's a great
use
point.
subsidized loans or grants, but I can only use them on certain pathways for certain credentials,
Yep.
well, that tells me what government values, doesn't it?
That's a good point.
And that's where I'm going to go because the incentive structure is built that way. So if we want to have a more diverse array of credentials that could better address value in a wide variety of ways, we need to understand the business model and incentives that's going to really pave the way
Yeah.
for those pathways. And we have to have that hard conversation, and that's where quality assurance is going to come into
Yeah.
play, but we're way behind the ball as far as I'm concerned.
I think that's really fair. And tracing the lines of, again, what kind of learning we pay for where. We invest millions of dollars in training military personnel every single year. We invest dollars through our workforce system. We invest dollars through our, through federal financial aid, which is a huge bucket of money. We also have dollars that are spent on education and training through Health and Human Services. So there's SNAP ENT programs. But all of those have different quality assurance mechanisms and different accountability metrics to them that are often not about the learner. And so it gets really complex of, how do we have a collective conversation about quality when we have so many different funding streams and lines going into investing in people, but we can't maximize all that to say, here's the talent that we have in this country. How do we help everybody be a part of this talent ecosystem? And then we don't again, on the transfer piece, are like, well, that's just not quality. I'm sorry we were talking earlier about if I was doing, medic on the battlefield, I don't need to relearn how to do blood pressure work. I work under pressure. So how do we, again, maximize this, not just for the learners, but also that's really inefficient from our tax dollars perspective.
I'm afraid I just add a finer point to that. Not just the fragmentation of all that, but the level. So Pell Grants on a good year were north of
Right.
$30 billion. Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, just over $3 billion. Think about that. And that's split 50 different ways and then fragmented
Yes.
even further at the local level. And precious little of it goes to actual training.
Right.
So compare these systems and tell
That's
me where
right.
our values are.
100%.
Absolutely. And who gets directed to the workforce system versus the higher education system? Disaggregate that data, you'll see very quickly why we have so much inequity.
Totally. On the Pell front, I thought there was a state, maybe Indiana, that was giving prior credit for, in essence, you were allowed to go back and say, hey, I took these two courses at a CC. I didn't finish the CC, but nevertheless, I'm actually going to get the Pell grants for the 2 credits I got, and then use those to pay for further education within Ivy Tech or whatever state system it was.
The state can pay for that. You can't use federal Pell dollars to
Go
for credit.
retroactively.
You have to show value add. So that's the other piece, Luke, you brought up about giving credit for prior learning. That costs some kind of business model money, right?
Sure.
But there's no money to actually make that a reality in the system because you can't use any of those dollars to do that for the student. So the cost either gets paid to the student, like we're going to charge you, again, to reassess something you already know it could do, or the institution will eat the cost.
Got it.
Yeah, it's like flipping your lens on debt. So we studied and found there were, 1,600 students that we were keeping out of the system because they owed less than $500.
Yes.
Some owed as
Yes.
little as $25. We're not doing this anymore. We're clearing that debt. It's a barrier to them, and we're just carrying debt. It is not good for anyone,
Yeah.
right? So I think sometimes it's no, let's flip how we're looking at the problem. And you really brought up a point. You didn't use the word, but you hinted at policy. And I was interested, Sean, I know you study this. Do you see policy changes on the horizon? Because what's scary for my colleges is, Luke, we live in a state where our outcome is based on certificate and associate degree. I don't get credit for a micro-credential or a micro-pathway. So if someone stops out a credit short of my certificate, I'm penalized, even though their outcome, based on your business model, is exactly what you want, right? It feeds into the talent pipeline. So are you seeing when you check attitudes, a shift on policy? And
It's regional and it's probably state by state. I'm thinking in this conversation how many times have specific state innovations always come up, right? And that's just here in the United States. Less when you look
Global.
at providers out of the UK or Latin America or Asia or wherever. This is event represents it. It's a global education market increasingly. You can get things that are maybe even free or high value, low cost online, and there's more mobility. But the whole structure of the post-secondary system, what is it, 300 billion maybe in terms of the budget, or the revenue of private and public institutions in the U.S. It's all these little fiefdoms, and certain states are doing it well, and other states are probably laggards.
maybe that's a future
And,
study.
and the lack of kind of federal policy compared to maybe the innovation directions in the Obama administration,
Right.
and then you had Trump with apprenticeships, and there's been certain themes. But I think and you're the DC and policy expert, I think, Jason, just the nature of the dialogue right now. Everything's kind of frozen, and there's not money for some of these things. Even going back 10 years, right? You don't see those sort of we're
No.
going to have a DARPA for education, or we're going to put $1 billion here or there. And other nations, right, the UK, Singapore, in some cases they're either taxing employers or finding ways, Canada, experiential learning in Ontario, they create a fund basically, and then they kind of redistribute that out either to the institutions or the individuals to pursue lifelong learning.
Yeah.
So there are kind of interesting policy, innovations and funding streams outside the US, not that they're perfect,
Yeah,
but
my-
we have 50 different structures to that, and then the lack of kind of federal momentum.
If you're going to look at the federal level, Right now, probably the most interesting thing happening is around the Competes Act, because as part of that act, they're trying to tie not only the Credential Transparency Act, but also Workforce Pell. Not in a perfect way. There's still way too many constraints on it, but it's something. And how long have we been working at that?
Forever.
So maybe if Competes moves, we might have some federal momentum, but we're not holding our breath necessarily. So that's the one thing I'd watch, and I'd also be very wary of negotiated rulemaking. Because, well, yeah, you might get legislation going, but negotiated rulemaking might bring the whole field back.
Yep.
So we have just a few more minutes left, and I do have like one question for you. So, and I think you guys can all answer this one. I mentioned that as we're starting to get more and more credentials flooding the market, it's hard for employers to kind of make sense of that and understand what has value, what has the skills that they need. But that's even more problematic for individuals and students. And if we're before, right, when you're talking about like how do I decide if this degree is going to get me the job? Well, how do I decide what degree or micro-credential or combination of degree and micro-credential or certificate? I mean, it's becoming more and more complex for individuals to be able to make decisions about what's really going to, help them achieve their goals. So I've heard conversations about, needing to do much more upfront counseling from like enrollment counselors and so forth to help individuals make good decisions. But what are your thoughts on how we make some of this value of credentials more transparent? I think you mentioned helping individuals become more savvy about those decisions they're making. Like, what are some of the things that we could do to
So I'll start
help
with a
that?
non-LinkedIn thing and even a non-tech thing, even though we're at an EdTech conference. And I think at EdTech conferences in particular, we have to emphasize humans more and the role of like career coaches as an example. So the systems where community colleges and workforce development boards have come together, and you have the huge number of career developers at workforce boards who, to be frank, aren't doing as much work now as they used to because there's not enough people knocking on their doors. Thank you for the, I'll speak louder. So one of the ideas is that get those folks in the workforce boards to just walk into the community college and help the students so that every single one has a human being helping them with the social determinants of educational success and career success, including what microcred or certificate or degree should I be seeking. And that additional labor force is going to cost money. It's the kind of thing that probably the feds and states are going to have to invest in. Maybe even employers could invest in if they want to sort of invest in their local community colleges or libraries or workforce boards. But it is human beings that I think are a crucial part of that process.
I really like that, and I think we've seen some places be successful when they've co-located that, right? I don't walk over to a Work One center and then have to walk over to the community college or drive over, right? Like, time is not a luxury for me if I'm in that place, and I don't have time to drive 5 different offices. Put that stuff all in one place. When I walk in, there's somebody who helps me understand that. But we also need to give them good data. And one of the things that I've learned that's really important in this is not just the credential and employment outcomes, but when we merge that up with folks from Health and Human Services who are probably working with folks on access to benefits, so food sustainability, housing security, childcare subsidies. We may find when we analyze all that data that we got a person a credential with employable outcomes, but it wasn't enough to sustain them as a household. They actually wind up falling off at what is called a benefits cliff, where they are now not able to advance. So they feel like they've invested in this credential, they're one shot to get it done, they get a pay increase, everybody's celebrating, and then they find out they can't pay for childcare for their kid and can't get to work. That's not a system that's working for people. So I think we need to again, think differently about those human components, but also take the full picture of what's happening in people's lives and really guarantee that mobility.
I think there needs to be more communication and a sort of a campaign. I don't know how we pay for it, but just clearer awareness for consumers. And I guess maybe I'll speak to what the higher education system could do, colleges and universities, and saying like, okay, here's these new offerings or even the existing degrees. Here's what they do, here's what they don't do. Here's the kind of opportunities it's going to create for you, but it's super industry and occupationally specific. Right? If as Luke did, you could talk about certain zones where it's very well understood and architected, and then other ones that are a complete mess, and other ones that are, a little bit better. So it really varies.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Sarah, to your question, I think there's 2 things we're committed to do on the private sector side. Like, we're committed to send better signals around which employers are going to be recruiting from which programs and credentials, and be very transparent, so students understand the connection between supply and demand. We're going to do that hard work. The second thing we're going to commit to do is close the gap in outcomes data. That's data held by employers, and we're trying to find the right model and incentives to liberate that data in a more organized way. So we're going to work on that.
Free the data.
And then the third point, which is beyond our control, but I think we all need to work on together, is a culture change. And I think we need to really start approaching these career pathways and engaging people as career entrepreneurs. And we need to get them to start thinking about value and organizing that plan and pathway so we better understand how they're making decisions there. Because we could have all the data in the world, from College Scorecard or from JetX if that ever comes to be, or LinkedIn or MC Learning Class. It doesn't mean it's going to change human behavior. We talk about behavioral economics. We need to understand how people are responding to certain information and making decisions based on it. And some of that's going to require a culture change if we're going to realize the vision that's been laid out here.
Yeah. Excuse me. I have light sensitivity. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So you can Google upskill essay ! And the best success we ever had was with Goodwill Industries San Antonio. So pre-pandemic, 1,600 employees, 2 major business divisions, about a $90 million company a year. And when we had an embedded career coach that they funded and licensed professional counselors that they referred to as life coaches, it was the best ecosystem. There is an ecosystem that will work. But the employees needed someone inside to affirm them consistently that they had made the right decision and they were making sufficient progress. And so I'm a big fan of the wraparound services. We talked a little bit about that, but I think that's the linchpin for this to be successful.
Well, and I think to kind of flip that sort of career services model, like right now, a lot of students kind of see that at the last, like maybe they go their junior year, senior year, if at all, and there's such a small proportion of students that actually take advantage of those services. So what do we need to do to sort of flip that, to have those really important conversations up front to make sure that students are really choosing their programs wisely? So, but with that, I know we're just a little bit over time, so I just want to say thank you guys so much. I know you guys, this was great. Thank you.